Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey, it's your pediatric dietitian, Jill, and welcome back to the Nourished Child Podcast. I'm glad to have you here, and if it is your first time being here, welcome. You're in for a treat today. Have you ever felt like your child is just eating way too much sugar? Or have you wondered how you might swap things out to improve the overall food balance in your child's diet? According to the CDC, the average child consumes about 17 teaspoons or almost 6 tablespoons of sugar each day. Young children consume about 12 teaspoons of sugar a day, and school-age kids are that representation of 17 teaspoons a day. The goal, as set by the dietary guidelines for Americans, which I've talked to you about on the show before, is no added sugar for children under age 2 and less than 10% of the total energy a child eats during the day coming from added sugar. We know when we look at sugar intake in children, the products that are contributing the most sugar in children's diets are sweetened beverages, baked goods, and candy. Those are the top 3. But those are quickly followed by sweetened, ready-to-eat cereal and flavored milk. Additionally, 66% of Americans are trying to reduce their sugar intake, but they are afraid of artificial sweeteners. So today, my guest will help us explore this whole area of sweetness, or how we can use low or no calorie sweeteners to help reduce overall sugar intake. I'm super excited to have Adams Berzins on the show today. He is a distinguished research and development professional with over 20 years of experience in the food and beverage industry. He currently serves as Global Sugar Reduction Lead at Ingredion Incorporated. I met Adams at a conference I was at in January, and he is truly an expert in sweetness. And I think you're going to find that he has a nice, balanced approach to this whole topic. We are talking about a bunch of different things. Number one, the difference between artificial and natural sweeteners, the safety of their use, what's happening in the world of sweetness, specifically what's on the horizon in terms of innovation and what can you expect to see in the grocery store, and the information you need to make a good choice for your children and for your family, whether that's to keep sugar in the diet, swap some of it out with sweeteners, or go all in. The intention of this episode is to give you more information about sweetness and how it's used in our food supply and whether it might or might not be a good choice for you and your family. I'm so excited for this conversation. And without further delay, here's Adams. Hello, Adams. Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast.
Hi, Jill. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. We had a little pre-conversation about our meeting a couple of weeks ago at a conference and just adjusting to life and getting back. If you're watching this podcast interview on YouTube, you will be able to see that it is snowing quite profusively in the background for Adams. He's in Chicago, correct? Yes.
Yes.
And he is an expert on reducing sugar, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I know so many of the people who listen to this podcast are very interested in cutting down sugar in a way that is reasonable for their children. So this is an area that you are very experienced in. And I think what's confusing for the consumer and parents particularly is this idea of 0-calorie sweeteners or non-nutritive sweeteners, meaning there's no nutrition in them, right? But can you describe, from your expertise and your, perspective, what is a non-nutritive sweetener?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great place to start. I mean, I think when we as food scientists, food formulators consider sweeteners, right? There is, like you said, nutritive and non-nutritive, and that generally is about caloric density, right? Nutritive sugars, maple syrup, agave, these types of stuff that have calories, nutritive, and then ones that don't contribute calories. And so when we talk about that, the typical ones that most people will recognize are things that they consider artificial sweeteners. So saccharin, sucralose, aspartame, ACE-K or asulfame potassium. If you have any international listeners, cyclamate, things like that you'll also see around. The pink packet, the blue packet, the yellow packet, right? That's often the largest of the sort of historical class of non-nutritive sweeteners. But beyond that, in the last 10 years, you also have what most folks consider natural non-nutritive sweeteners. So those are things that are based on stevia. Monk fruit is another one. And then there's emerging technologies that, I'm sure we'll touch on that provide new plant-based sources. And so when we think of artificial versus natural, it's really about the source material. And those are what we consider non-nutritive that don't contribute calories as consumed, typically are significantly sweeter on sort of a mass balance versus sugar, right? So if you think of something like stevia is, depending on the stevia, 200 to 400 times as sweet as sugar. So you only need a very, very little bit to get the same amount of sweetness that you would if you were using a gram of sugar. So it's how we sort of block those two apart.
Right. And of the artificial sweeteners, can you just give us a brief idea of how those are made?
Sure. Most of them come from synthetic sources and are catalyzed chemical reactions to either modify a central structure, right? So, aspartame has sort of a protein core that's modified with some compounds to make it significantly sweeter. Same thing with sucralose, and sucralose being the Splenda brand that most people are familiar with is, it's a chlorinated sugar, right? So they take sugar and they add some chlorine molecules to it to make it 600 times as sweet as sugar, things like that. So it's mostly the starting material is inorganic, sort of often sort of petrochemical based starting material.
Okay.
Which differs from the plant-based ones, which are all, they come from plant sources, right? Things like stevia is one. Stevia is the same family as the sunflower or chrysanthemum family as well. So it's sort of a large family of plants. You have monk fruit. It's also called lohangguo, which is a fruit grown in southern China. And then what we also know is that there are these other sweet compounds that come from other sources, sort of rare berries and things like that you can arrive at that are also from plants, right? And you think of, if you think of the sweetness from a fruit, yes, it's sugar, but it's also fructose, it's glucose, dextrose, maltose. So the simple carbohydrates in your fruit sweetness, those are also sort of plant-based and thinking, but it's about how those things come from versus the artificials that are, really manufactured from sort of non-organic material.
Okay. So there's, I know consumers are super attracted to words like natural sweeteners. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit more because I do want to dive into stevia in particular. But if you were to sort of roll back the clock and think about when these products were sort of introduced into the food supply, can you tell us a little bit about the history of how they came to be and why they're in the food supply?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's the history of, one of the sort of popular fun things when we talk about food science in general. There's a lot of really great stories or fun stories about how, this guy at Dow Chemical was working on a new adhesive and he licked his finger and he's like, oh, wow, now I have to look at this. It's sweet. Maybe I'll find a place for it. Right. And a lot of those innovations and fun things were happening in the 50s and 60s. Right in the mid to late 70s, early 80s is when we started to see things like saccharin, aspartame come into the market. For those of your listeners who are familiar with Tab, one of the first diet sodas, zero calorie sodas back in the day. There's always been this sort of societal attention to paying attention to calories or sugar, right? I think there's, for various cultural reasons, has been, and there was a utility to that. It's people want sweet tasting things. Humans generally like sweet tasting things, and as a food industry, wanted to provide that, but with lower calories and lower sugar intake. And so there was this adoption, and through the 80s and 90s, you'll get aspartame, sucralose, ACE-K, other things like if you look into the research, you Google artificial sweeteners, you'll see advantame, neotame, some of these other really high potency artificial sweeteners. And those have all sort of accelerated up into the late 90s, maybe a little bit in the early 2000s. And so as a sweetness sort of researcher, somebody who does this every day, you think about that in a generational space. As much as, and I still like to think that the 80s were 20 years ago, like in fact,
me too,
40, right? Yes, it's in fact 40 years ago. And so you think of the 70s, really? Right? So we have generations of people who have had exposure and access to these artificial sweeteners in a way that became very useful for making things taste good, making things lower in calories, lower in sugar. And there was a demand. There was and continues to be a demand for people that want things that taste good, meet their sweet tooth, but they can still feel good about because they have lower calories, lower sugar.
And speaking of demand, I remember in the presentation that you gave, I wrote down that 66% of the population or people in the United States are trying to reduce sugar, but they are also afraid of artificial sweeteners.
Yes.
That's quite a tension.
Yes, it really is. It really is. And I think the perpetual balance of value and sort of, I'll use both sides of the word value, right? It's like what people value in their food choices, right? They want it to be better for them. They want it to taste good, but then also they want it to provide, pocketbook value, right? And so finding ways to balance that out, the market offers a wide range of options. And so you see people making that compromise for what they see as their own health of reducing the amount of sugar. And there's a lot of options for non-nutritive sweetener containing products that meet that.
So let's talk about safety. And that is one of the questions I get all the time from parents that I work with individually. And then I just know on a consumer level, you look at social media, for example, and there's so much questioning around whether it's food dyes or other additives, which non-nutritive sweeteners would fall under the category of additives. So what do you know around safety of the artificial sweeteners versus the natural sweeteners?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think it's important to consider them situationally in a lot of ways, right? And almost every I think I can safely say every regulatory body that has done an evaluation on, especially the artificials because they've been around longer, that on the basis of consuming them as recommended, so very, very low usage levels, and sort of in a day-to-day product, are safe. Right? That they don't contribute any specific acute condition, right? The consumption doesn't, and even overconsumption within guardrails are safe. Now, that being said, I also fully appreciate that folks often associate artificial with unhealthy or unsafe, and sort of writ large in the word of artificial even beyond artificial sweeteners. And there are studies, and we're obviously always doing more research and trying to better understand. And there is some interesting research on the microbiome, trying to understand the mechanisms by which the body processes more specifically. I think there are some questions coming about artificial sweeteners, but still the propensity of data still suggests when used as recommended are safe. But there definitely is an emphasis more towards now, but that also crosses with the sort of sustainability, environmental impact of those things, which we also, want to consider. And, people have concerns of these, maybe chemicals that don't break down in the environment and are found downstream. And these artificial compounds certainly do, right? I mean, sucralose you can find quite easily in waste reclamation waters, right? So so this is a thing. I mean, now mechanistically, if it's passing through you, it's not doing anything on its way through because it's not interacting, right? So there's some logic of, right? So it's an interesting way of looking at it, but it's also, we are in a space where if you look at observational studies versus, and this is what I meant by situational, like there are observational studies out there that do suggest that people and children who consume artificials tend to, there's some of them, not all of them, it's not a conclusive body of work, correlate to people that also have gained weight over the time period of the observational study, observational being self-reported, right? Now, the studies that showcase swapping from an energy density perspective, a caloric sweetener with a non-caloric sweetener, those people lose weight, right? So on a head-to-head basis, give them full sugar soda, you give them a diet soda or zero sugar soda, and those people do lose weight because they've consumed less energy, and it's a net positive or, a net benefit in that. So it's kind of how you use them, and it's the challenges in the research of when you talk about an observational study, it's very hard to control for confounding factors.
Sure.
And so it's hard to say whether they were already maybe in a metabolically risky category, and so they're just more naturally consuming high potency sweeteners because they're already concerned about their weight. And so it's like, it's a challenge, but safety wise, in terms of recommendations for people in my life, my advice is if you're using them as recommended, say having a diet soda with your lunch once a day, not really much to be concerned with. Now, and this goes even beyond artificial sweeteners. If you're the type of person that is consuming 12, 18, 24 servings of any beverage, and it's full sugar or artificial, you're consuming a lot of something where you could be, and to the World Health Organization and various others, like you could be choosing water. And all studies suggest you choose water, it's better, right? Better for you all around. And I think water is great. And I think I'm confident in saying that we are in one of the most water safe times ever, right? In terms of access to clean, drinkable water, kind of wherever you live in the world is getting better year over year. But we also like sweet things. We like to enjoy our food. Water is great. Drinking water is wonderful. People should. And there's really no science that suggests drinking any form of flavored water over regular water is a better choice on baseline. However, we know, and parents know, kids like sweetness. We like sweetness. It's just something to take care of. And so if sweetness can help, say, consume, if you're underweight, something like a protein shake, those things can not taste that good. But if you don't really want the sugar for whatever reason, right? I mean, managing people's weight's a complex argument. But if the usage of a non-nutritive sweetener helps you get lots of other nutrients, right? I think flavored milk is one of these interesting debates that have typically high sugar, but studies suggest that if you take that sweetness and flavor out, they're not going to drink the milk,
Right.
And so is it better to drink the milk,
Right.
regardless of if the flavor is there, to get those nutrients? And so I do see that the nuance to it, but ultimately it's safe. And even as you talk about the sort of natural sweeteners, right? The studies that have been done on that include stevia and monk fruit and things like that, which, if I can make that point, this is one of the things that, as a natural sweetness sort of researcher and developer, oftentimes when it's reported, oh, non-nutritive sweeteners, no calorie sweeteners in these studies,
Mm-hmm.
it's a minuscule number of those studies that have even looked at stevia or monk fruit. But stevia and monk fruit often get lumped together in that class of sweeteners when it's reported in a very basic way out to the public.
So are you saying stevia and monk fruit are somewhat misrepresented when it comes to media reporting about potential side effects, potential safety issues?
Yeah, they do. I think one of the things that's very much a pet peeve is when I'm reading articles or I see a news report where they say something like, oh yes, and sucralose and aspartame or stevia and other artificial sweeteners, right? That it's just sort of a throwaway of combining all those pieces. And I won't get too much into the sort of the molecular structures of things, but like how your body interacts with all of those compounds is actually different, right? Their chemical structures are different. And so if you really are trying to hunt for a mechanism that gives you a reason for concern, which is ultimately what you want to try to uncover, it's not correlative. It's not just like, oh, that person uses a lot of Splenda and they happen to have developed some issues. It's something is happening. And so when you talk about a plant-based sort of terpene type molecule like stevia versus a chlorinated glucose unit, sucrose unit like sucralose, like how your body treats those is different. And so it's hard when it gets lumped in sort of that, like you said, that sort of mischaracterization. It takes some time to separate those two. And I very much appreciate when people think of, artificial sweeteners, their main exposure tends to be at a restaurant. You have the pink, blue, yellow packets, and now the green packet is there with a stevia version, right? So it's easy to be like, oh, well, I have the container of sugar, right? White table sugar, and then the little thing of, quote unquote artificials. And so I totally get it. And most people will live happy lives not thinking about sweeteners as much as I do. And so I get it. But, I think that's where, my job comes in and try to help educate folks to understand that there are differences and there are, reasons to consider in those options when, if you choose to want to restrict the amount of sugar that you're consuming, and for most people, certainly in America, that's a good idea. Why you might want to pick a plant-based version versus an artificial and the potential benefits there, and you're kind of what stevia offers and where it's come and things like that, especially.
Yeah. So PSA, folks who are listening, artificial sweeteners and natural sweeteners are very different. Stevia and monk fruit are natural sweeteners. They come from a plant, and artificial sweeteners are chemically created in a lab.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we've got that parsed out. And I think, I actually think that's just such a important distinction, not because I don't think artificial sweeteners are safe. I do think they're safe, but in the scope of things, if you can go with a plant-based natural sweetener, to me, it's sort of like, why wouldn't you? Yes. I mean, that's how I view it for my own children. So let's talk about, so I'll tell you a little story. When I was in high school in the 80s, way back in the early 80s, I'm sharing my age here. My girlfriend, my best friend, loved Tab, and she used to drink Tab all the time. We never had soda in the house. I mean, my mom would buy a can of frozen orange juice on Sunday and reconstitute it with water. And my dad would make eggs and bacon and toast. And that was like the most indulgent drink we got all all week. But my girlfriend was I mean, she drank a lot of Tab and she loved Tab. And even when Diet Coke came out, so we're talking mid 80s, she could not make the switch to Diet Coke because it wasn't as sweet as Tab.
Interesting.
So it's always stuck with me because I know we had this conversation about sweet preferences and do non-nutritive sweeteners, drive a preference for sweetness? Does it further sort of enhance that preference that most kids are naturally born with? But, is there any sort of, I don't want to use the word addictive, but sort of attachment to sweetness that can come from a non-nutritive sweetener? And are there pathways, as you indicated before, sort of like metabolic pathways or neural pathways that this sweetness goes through that, makes it more likely that you'll be sort of attached to a specific type of sweetness or a specific degree of sweetness?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's a couple ways that I want to sort of tackle that, right? I think there is the basic understanding of how we perceive sweetness from a taste bud mechanism. Mm-hmm. And that does matter. There's parts of the population that just refuse the way their tongues work with high potency sweeteners in general. Mm-hmm. It completely turns them off. It does not appeal to them. And so we know that there's some structural pieces that contribute to people liking certain types of sweeteners and sweetness and others. I think we're still doing a body of work to understand really that sort of neural pathway, really we do know that generally speaking, your brain can recognize sweetness and alert other things happening in your body process, and we know that sort of really that insulin driver or insulin response, and that generally speaking, non-nutritive sweeteners are letting your brain know that there is sweetness there, but not metabolically letting you know that you don't necessarily need insulin. But even that is not conclusive in terms of the body of work there. So it's still some work to understand. I think now, then there is the cultural, the exposure, the sweet preference world, right? Like we know, to the story of your girlfriend there, it's, because I also hear this, folks, with people that are going from regular Coke to Diet Coke, right? Like it is, no, I just like this profile more, right? Like and a lot of the times it's because it's what they're used to. Like you can get accustomed to a flavor that kind of has nothing to do neurologically. It's just, I can sort of invent a little story of like the first time that your girlfriend tried Tab. It's a beautiful sunny day. She felt really good. She looked really good when she was drinking it, and that helped. And then, you're like, okay, great. I'm going to drink Tab because I like it. And it makes me feel good, independent of what it does inside your body. And, this becomes kind of a recognition of comfort for your brain as much as it is a physical chemical taste response. And it is generationally kind of what we also face when people are like, no, I don't like stevia. I don't like monk fruit. I don't like I don't like how Splenda tastes. Right. And it's, well, sure. If your association with non-nutritive sweeteners is aspartame, because started drinking Diet Coke in the 80s, 90s, whatever. And now suddenly there's something that's like, look, this is just as good, or it's natural, right? Which is a big selling point and for a lot of folks. And they're like, yeah, but I don't like it. And oftentimes in things that we learn in consumer studies is consumers are really good. And I think kids more vocally than others, because I know they were talking to a lot of parents, they don't like something. they'll let you know, and they'll
Absolutely.
remind you the next time you try to give it to them that they don't like it.
So true.
Right?
Yeah.
And again, a lot of that has to do with things that may or not be the factors of the actual product, but it is part of it, right? And it's whatever that association was at the time can drive that liking. Now, sweetness overall, and if folks remember the Pepsi challenge, right? Pepsi as a product is slightly sweeter than the blue can is slightly sweeter than the red can. And then the maroon can, the Dr. Pepper folks, I don't want to leave anybody out, is a little bit sweeter than both of those. People on a blind taste test picked the Pepsi over the Coke. It was a big marketing thing in the late 90s. But we see this constantly over sensory tests. Like, people just like things when they're sweeter. They just given a driver of liking, sweetness. We did a big global proprietary study on beverages and consumers in 5 different countries, and it confirmed again, right? Products that are sweeter, people tend to like more. So I think the best speculation there is that that's just evolutionary, right? We associate sweetness was rare. Sweetness was usually attached to getting fiber, getting other nutrients, other things like that. Like if you think of fruits and all the sort of out of the ground places that we tend to get sweetness from. That there's that association with it. So it's which I think also drives kind of back to one of your earlier questions. It's like, this is why it's in the food supply, right? This is why it's there, because people like things to be sweet in general. And there's a sense of joy attached with that. And that's also why it's such a balance, why it's such a challenge for people to cut down on the amount of sugar in their lives. I think it's why it's easy for folks to claim, and I agree, I think it's very much a misrepresentation to use the word addictive. Really the most, if not all, of the sort of brain link to sweetness stuff is not particularly well controlled in terms of a scientific design. And it's not speaking ill. I don't think anybody's intentionally trying to mislead anybody on it. It's just a field we're trying to better understand. But it's not a stretch. And I think people who struggle to cut sugar out, thinking of it in the same way as somebody that can't cut out other things out of their life, is an easy association. So I don't begrudge people from understanding that term, but it's also one of those things that other people associate with addiction are not things that you need metabolically. Alcohol, for instance, right? But your body does need glucose to do most of its major functions. And kids more so, and developing. I mean, it's a lot of why flavored milks were put in schools. It's a lot of why, grains are fortified, right? There was a big calorie problem and an energy problem for the vast majority of children. And we won't dive into how archaic a lot of our food laws are that have supported that. I mean, that's certainly have that discussion some other time, or your listeners can look me up on LinkedIn or wherever and poke me in my DMs. But yeah, it's just a thing that we face of people liking sweetness, and it contributes to how they end up wanting or associating things and trying to overcome that societal piece, right? I mean, we hear about this, especially like in the South, where generally folks like things at a higher level of sweetness. And that's, that ends up being a cultural thing. We see it globally, especially Southeast Asia, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. Their desserts are so sweet. A lot of Indian desserts are just syrupy and delicious and wonderful, but
very sweet.
But very, very sweet. And so we've moved from those things being rare and treats to people just consuming more than we're active enough to really utilize.
Right. So when we think about just a really side question, because this occurred to me. You were talking about the Pepsi and the Coke, the Pepsi challenge, and now we have the Coke Zero, but we still have Diet Coke. What is the difference between a Diet Coke and a Coke Zero?
Sure. So
you're educating me.
Yeah, no,
I really don't drink a lot of soda, so.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, it's the sweetener system, right? I mean, I think the sweetener system in Diet Coke is really heavily aspartame based. Okay. Coke Zero brings in some other combinations of sweeteners and other tools to sort of change, modify the sweetness in a way that brings the diet consumer or zero sugar consumer closer to the perception of sugar
Of real
as
sugar.
opposed to aspartame, right? Like that is the goal of the zero versions, right? And I think it's Diet Coke is a really interesting case study in this to some degree. And this is all public information. I don't think my friends in Atlanta will get annoyed in any of this, but like people really like it, right? I mean, there's often a joke or a meme of folks that like Diet Coke is one of those things that it's not even a question, right? It's almost a way of life that they enjoy their Diet Coke, and Coke Zero's not it for them. I think coming back to that point of comfort, that's what they're used to. They really like it as a specific flavor profile that is helped achieved with aspartame, but it's not the aspartame that they're craving or that they desire. It's just something about the whole drinking experience. But I think it's also really interesting how much I would say the newer introductions in a lot of ways in the zero products, right? Whether it's Pepsi, Coke, Dr. Pepper, whomever, the trend is to be more like sugar. And sugar was always the goal, right? But it is aspartame is still very prevalent in a lot of places and is a known flavor. But I mean, I think Coke Zero is interesting because they're trying to get their product to taste better and better every day, right? They're all product formulators are trying to improve things. And they've started including stevia as part of that solution, in addition to the artificial sweetener. So they've added a natural sweetener to help round it out. And it, continues to drive it closer to sugar. Which is, a lot about the complex interplay of how your tongue perceives sweetness. I like to liken it to like a Monet, like close up, it's a series of blobs.
Yes.
You step way back and you see it for the totality, right? Yeah. So when you take different sweetener compounds, your tongue in isolation sees them as blobs, but it is able to recognize them all together as a more complete sweet profile. And that's really where the future of sweetness and sweeteners is going, is not single compounds, right? We've come from the 80s and 90s where it was aspartame, sucralose, ACE-K, right? Like one chemical compound. And now it's very much like, no. It turns out your tongue is super complex. It's not good enough for it just to hit the sweetness. It's all of that other perception. Maybe you want that syrupiness that you get with a full sugar soda. Maybe you want, linger is something people with high potency sweeteners complain about. They keep tasting it after they're done drinking. You kind of want that to go away. And so everything that we can do to make things taste more like sugar, things like that, still tends to be the gold standard for a lot of people. But also 0 calorie and 0 sweet, 0 sugar things are popular. Yeah. And aspartame and sucralose get you there.
Yeah, they are. So when, we've been talking about artificial sweeteners, we've been talking about natural sweeteners. I want to shift now into stevia because that's really your area of work and expertise. But just on a high level, how is a parent supposed to know whether something is artificial or natural when they go out and buy products? How can they tell the difference?
The easiest way really is to look at the ingredient deck, right? None of these things are present in your food without it being listed, right? And so I think that's, understanding that. I think for the artificials, it's aspartame, it's saccharin, it's sucralose, asulfame, potassium, ACE-K. You'll sometimes see, there's sort of a rare disorder of amino acid processing called fetal ketonurics. You'll see that on the label. Those are all indicative of artificial sweeteners. And I think that's usually very clearly listed. More and more products, you'll see consumer products that say no artificial sweeteners, no artificial colors, right? The FTC and the FDA and the USDA have a pretty good system in place. Like you especially for US-based consumers, you can't make those front of pack claims with, and then also include it, right? Like you can't say no artificial sweeteners and then include sucralose, right? That's some people are checking for that. And then also the general consumer and public interest groups will absolutely go and sue a big food manufacturer if they're being dishonest with that. So there is a measure of becoming familiar with your packaging. When you look at now natural sweeteners, this can be a little more confusing because I think a lot of times the different names by which you can label these things can make people feel a little less comfortable. I'll use stevia as the main example, is that, you know, the compounds within stevia are called stevioglycosides. This is a chemical family of, right, the molecular family of these tools. From a scientific basis, really simple way of defining what these compounds are that come from the stevia leaf. And there's over 100 that have taste and sweetness value, individual molecules. When you label them in the simplest way, stevioglycosides gives people flashbacks of high school chemistry that they didn't want to be at, right? Like it's a very, right, like it's a very scientific sounding name, though technically correct, difficult. And I've said this, I said it at the conference, and I say it all the time. Don't let scientists name things that marketers should be involved with. That's just, you know, we lost that battle in high fructose corn syrup as well, right? It's like, no, we invented corn syrup and then we made a high fructose version. And like, it's true. That's what it is. Turns out that's also confusing for folks. So coming back to the natural sweetener piece, like stevioglycosides is natural, and it's actually the most technically accurate way of simplest for manufacturers, because it can get a little bit more murky depending on the combination of molecules they're using from stevia. You can call out stevia leaf extract, which is super nice. People like leaves. People understand what extracts are. Stevia leaf extract is great. Stevia leaf sweetener is another good one. Stevia extract is another good one. Sometimes there's really only two molecules that you'll see identified by themselves, Reb A or ribodioside A, or Reb M or ribodioside M, or iterations of those. You'll also sometimes see ribodiana. That's an older name for things. All of those are different ways of labeling stevia, stevia sweeteners. And I guess the call out there is, just because the name is the technical Latin name, the stevioglycosides, it doesn't make it any less natural, because we've chosen to call out the molecules rather than the plant.
Right.
So, which is also why we also see a lot of, and parents especially, love the label of monk fruit juice concentrate, monk fruit extract. Like, fruit is great. We're all supposed to be eating tons of fruit. It's good for it, right? That one's a simpler one. You're less likely to see lo han guo or one of the more traditional Chinese names for the fruit. And then we can get into the taste aspects of where those things differ. But that's what you're looking for with natural, these plant-based natural high potency sweeteners, non-nutritive sweeteners, is usually some like the STEV, stevial glycoside, stevia extract, right? Like, that's the simplest way to recognize whether it contains stevia and whether they're using a natural sweetener, because stevia is still much more prevalent in sort of non-artificial sweetened products than monk fruit is today. It's been around longer from a commercial marketplace perspective.
Yeah. So stevia is plant-based. It comes from a leaf. How, on a high level, how is it processed?
There's really three main ways to get to those molecules that you really want. The simplest and easiest one is just extraction, like you do with tea, like you make your tea in the morning, right? You steep these leaves, you then take that, you clean it up, and you dry it, and you get a powder. That's sort of the simplest and basic one. What you can also do is, with the use of some sort of natural enzymes. They're the enzymes that the plant uses to do this biological process. They're just made by yeast somewhere else, and then you get it. You can take one of the molecules that's very common in the leaf and convert it to another molecule that's less common but tastes better, right? Mm-hmm. And I mentioned Reb A and Reb M. That's a great example, right? If you can take, because there's a lot of A in the leaf, but A has its limits. M tastes way better and is it's a much better tool, but is 100 times less available just in the leaf itself. Okay. But you can take that high available one, convert it to the low available one, get better tasting sweetness, better tasting products. The third way is you can take either glucose or sucrose, sugar, feed it to yeast, and these typically genetically modified yeasts, and they will spit out stevia molecules, stevia glycosides. And this is a really interesting space because precision fermentation unlocks a world of tools that are otherwise much more difficult to arrive at. And stevia is just one of many. But, you can look at things like insulin and citric acid, stuff like that uses fermentation technologies to be produced from dextrose sources, glucose sources. And so I think, and this is a bit of could be a brain teaser or a bit of a thought exercise for your listeners and certainly people wanting to better understand these tools. When you do that fermentation process, those molecules are the same as if you would find them in nature. So whether you've extracted them from the leaf, modified them to make through bioconversion, or crafted them with precision fermentation through yeast from sugar, it's the same molecule. So from a safety perspective, it's kind of all the same. Yeah. Right? There's no reason to believe that the fermented product or really the bioconverted products, the most prevalent, is any less safe for you in any appreciable way, in any way at all. I can say that. And so, but I also understand people, especially in a world where, the UPF, the ultra processed food question comes in, there's concerns of what do the processes possibly do, but overall, when you're talking about the metabolic impact, the health impact, getting to that better tasting product through better technology has a lot of advantages. It makes it less expensive, uses a lot less environmental impact. And so we try to be wise about that part too. But so a lot more around to manufacturing, but
Yeah. So if a parent wanted to sort of try out some stevia sweetened, food products for their kids or for their family, where are we seeing a lot of the products? Are there certain categories of food that we're seeing, obviously sweetened foods, but are they, cookies, or is it beverages or ice cream? I mean, where are we seeing sort of these stevia-based naturally sweetened products?
You'll see it, I think, a lot in beverages is, really a big driver for all things sweetness. But I think especially for natural sweeteners, a lot of your really big brands today that are, causing a shakeup in the marketplace, right? And these, whatever you want to call them, whether they're healthy sodas, I know there's. It's a tricky word, right? And then obviously, and I don't represent any of them. But, you have, folks like Olipop, Zevia, Poppy. I think, both the red can and blue can folks are launching their own versions under their own brands coming soon. And there's a dozen more, right? Slice is one that's out there. There's called Solar Pop or something, right? And there's at least a dozen, if not 24 new brands coming out in that space where you're very much seeing the natural sweeteners being the driver. Okay. And so, but yogurt, dairy, right? Dairy is another space. Yogurt and ice creams, right? I mean, things like Halo Top was a brand popular. They were using some stevia as well as some other sugar replacers. A fair amount of Greek yogurts, especially the ones that are 0 calories, 0 sugar, are all tending to use stevia. There's absolutely still brands that are using aspartame or sucralose, and that's comes down to a lot of brand positioning versus, if you have a health halo versus a budget halo. It's a lot of different ways that those things get positioned. But I would say beverage and dairy is definitely the highest place.
Okay.
But there's utility in bakery and beverage and confectionery and even sauces, right? I mean, I think one of the interesting pieces is that there are places and there are people that are doing it that, they just want to reduce the sugar a little bit. And so you'll see a little bit of stevia in like a ketchup or a barbecue sauce that is in no way trying to be all natural, 0 calorie barbecue sauce.
Right.
But what they realize is every little bit helps when talking about your sugar. So if your kid uses a lot of barbecue sauce on his chicken nuggets or a lot of ketchup and you're concerned, right? Like there are versions of those products that have lower sugar and they're tending to use stevia because those brands also recognize that parents are trending away from artificials.
Yeah.
Right? Like a low sugar ketchup that was sweetened with sucralose or aspartame. Again, like I said, perfectly safe from a consumption standpoint, but that doesn't change the perception that people have.
Right.
And so, and there was I forget if it was I think it was John Hayes, the researcher from Penn State, in his presentation also was about like better for you product, paraphrasing, better for you products do no good if they end up in the trash.
Right.
Right. And so it's like and in this case, if they don't even get off the shelf, right? If a parent's not going to buy a low sugar ketchup because it has an ingredient that they don't like, the kid is probably getting the full sugar ketchup. And if the concern is to reduce the ketchup, the fine folks at Kraft Heinz or Hunt's or whomever's making the ketchup would like you to have a product that makes you feel good and meets those needs that you want for your kid. And so that's a place where, and again, that's an interesting place because that's a less, and something for, again, why it's important to read the back of the packaging. Those types of places are less likely to have no artificial sweetener, or even reduced sugar on the front of the pack because I won't get into the sort of the consumer nature of front of pack labeling and stuff like that, but it's an interesting thing that, oh no, it's just less sugar. I feel better about it. And so you do start to see it more and more in other places. Most restaurants have the green packets now, for your coffee in the morning. I personally don't recommend those if you tasted stevia 10 years ago and didn't like it. Beverage technology's improved, yogurt technology's improved. Your tabletop sweeteners, not as prevalent using the best technologies. So if you're trying to reach out and get back into trying things with stevia, like some of those beverage brands that I said, those more functional soda type things are great places to see them. Things like Poppy, right, that they're out there, Zevia, Olipop, whatever, right? Those are all
try it that way versus taking a packet and sprinkling it on your cereal. Yeah. And it occurs to me too that, not everybody who's listening is interested in reducing sugar. This is really an episode to help you understand the difference between natural sweeteners versus artificial sweeteners and have a handle on what it all means. And, at the end of the day, you can feel safe about offering either of them. It is your prerogative and to choose whatever you want to choose, whether you want to go real sugar, table sugar all the way, no sweeteners at all. Or if you have a child who has a condition who might benefit from swapping out or reducing some of that table sugar in their diet, you might want to consider using a sweetener in some of the things. I mean, I have clients that they don't drink any water and they don't drink any milk and they just really drink things like lemonade and sweet tea. And, they're just not at that point where they're going to make a massive swap to water or milk. And so to me, this is a great option to help them move in a direction that is going to help them have improvements in the totality of their diet and hopefully their health as well.
Yeah.
So as we wrap this up, two questions. What is on the horizon for innovation in the sweetness industry? And I think I don't even need to ask you, can parents feel safe about offering these to kids? Because I think we've established that pretty well throughout this whole episode. But when we're thinking about what can we be seeing in the future in terms of natural sweeteners and innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think the things that I'm excited about right now are what fall under a category of natural sweeteners that come from proteins. Specifically, we call them sweet proteins. The sort of chemical names, right, are Brazine and monolin. Those are the two main ones that you'll start to hear about sparingly in the market. There's a few brands, but what the exciting part of those is, and I think I say Brazine and monolin, what you're more likely to see when they do come to market is oobleck fruit sweet protein, or oobleck. So it's I hope I get my geographies right. I believe oobleck comes from a West African fruit that creates this compound Brazine naturally. And so there are a number of companies that are advancing the technologies here through precision fermentation. So it's something. So using the best technology to get to these great tasting, these good tasting compounds, because in a lot of ways it's just impractical to do an extract from the fruits. Right? They're not commercial crops in a way that can be harvested effectively that can provide good tasting sweetness. I think the other one, so monolin, you'll start to see as, I believe, serendipity berry sweet protein. And there's another group that's working. There's a specific type of truffle. It's a honey truffle sweetener. That's another interesting space that, there's a rare truffle that, again, culinarily has been known for a long time, but has a sweet profile as opposed to that, sort of classic black truffle, sort of musky,
umami,
luxurious and deliciousness. But it has these sweet protein compounds that are also sweet, right? And so we're seeing those three kind of come to the forefront. But all through precision fermentation. It's a matter of getting comfortable, getting to these tools, and utilizing them in a way that, again, provides great tasting sweetness, gets people to come closer to the that sugar perception. Like if we're trying to move them off of sugar instead of off of artificials, right? Like there is a progression of wanting it to taste as close to what they're used to, just with less calories. But what I will say, what I find most exciting, and I mentioned before, right, the Monet model of getting different pieces to get the full picture. Sweet proteins plus stevia is probably the great unlock, right? And the ability to really create a sweetness profile of multiple natural sweetener compounds to really hit that mark. Because then again, like, this precision fermentation, you're also getting a lot more sustainability. You're getting feel good, and if it's serendipity berry versus monolin or Brazine, or I may be a scientist, and I may not name things particularly well, but I recognize that oobleck fruit sweet protein or serendipity berry, it's the benefit that monk fruit has had, right? It has a much more recognizable name as opposed to stevioglycosides, which, again, this is just things like sweetener nerds like me have to worry about. But I do also want to make one interesting comment. Wait. In terms of what's also coming is, how can we manage the sweetness perception that takes into account a lot more? So like ice cream and cakes and like sweet desserts, there's a challenge to get them to taste the way the sugar does, because sugar does so much more than sweetness. So you'll also see maybe more attention to rare sugars like allulose, or usage of fibers and texture ingredients to build that back. So more solutions type, these formulated type of solutions that replace the sugar, but maybe also have a positive benefit, right? If you're using a fiber or a resistant starch or something. So it's like swapping not just the sweetness, but also some of the functionality plus a benefit. We're definitely going to continue to see that innovation. And I think with kids, it's even more important as we see guidelines for higher fiber intake and less sugar and all those things. I think you're going to see some smaller companies and even big ones move in that direction. And there was one comment I wanted to make as it relates to the safety piece, because I agree. I think we've covered a good bit of that. One concern that I like to share is, as a scientist, if the data moves into a direction that we understand the mechanism of one of these compounds actually does correlate to a negative impact, like we will pivot and we will work to get that out of the food supply, right? I often feel like I have to defend the position of the food scientist in the food industry of, we don't want to promote something that people don't want and that is bad for them. On the scientific level, there is no advantage to being like, oh man, it tastes so good, but it, makes people's hair fall out. Let's, right? Like, being sort of absurd in the analogy, but it's like, no, like, we saw that with Olestra, right? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? It's like, from a functionality perspective, if you only ate one serving, it's great. Your body didn't absorb the fat. It was good for from a calorie management was great. What they didn't realize is that people eat the whole family size bag themselves. And so basically you just don't see that tool anymore, because consumers were like, no, I don't care what it does technically. I don't like what it does to me. And I think the industry recognized that. And if anything changes with the artificial sweeteners, whether it's aspartame, sucralose, whatnot, that the science catches up, or the science reflects something that we have concerns with, as a sweetener researcher and as somebody who communicates sweetener science, you can count on me coming back and being like, no, here's the data. Don't use those. But where I'm at now, I feel good. I also think that consumers want that natural piece, and that's why we keep investing in that natural space, trying to find new compounds, using AI and predictive modeling to find that new thing. How can we get there? That's, because it's not just low sugar. It's also people want to enjoy, like, coming all the way back, right? People want to enjoy what they're eating. And if we can provide a sweetness that people like and they can feel good about the product, nobody wants to sacrifice their pleasure in an eating situation. And
I agree.
And kids especially, they don't want to, they like what they like.
It's nice to know that there are lots of options out there, that the options are safe, and that, there's innovation and ongoing research, and things have evolved quite a bit since the single use artificial sweetener or natural sweetener. So I appreciate your work in this area so much. It's complex, and I know it can be confusing for really anybody out there. I mean, you really need to dive into it. So thank you so much for clarifying so much of this and making it easy to understand. I know that there will be people who might want to, hit your DMs, as you said.
Please, yeah.
How can people find your work, find you, stay in touch with you after this episode?
Professionally, I'm on LinkedIn. It's just my name. It's probably one of the easier places. I've started utilizing Instagram a little bit more in my free time. I like a lot of movies, and so my handle is Stevia Zissou, a reference to The Life Aquatic, the Wes Anderson film, the Bill Murray Wes Anderson film. And those really are the best places if you're looking for more information as well. So the Stevia Institute, which is a research site that's associated with Ingredion and Pure Circle and the companies that have been leading this innovation for the last 15, 20 years. I think those are kind of the best ways. I make no illusion. I work for Ingredion, and then, people can go to Ingredion's website and email me through there as well. And happy to chat and talk through things. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your insight and, again, making a complex topic very easy to understand.
Yeah, thanks. It was my pleasure, Jill. I really appreciate the opportunity.
That's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Adams Berzins on the topic of sweeteners. I'm still learning a lot about it, and I find it super intriguing. If you enjoyed the show, make sure while you're on your podcast app to follow the show. And if you have a spare second or two, give us a rating and a review. Don't forget, I have a bunch of free articles and educational resources over on thenourishedchild.com. And if you're really struggling, check out my private practice services. I work with families on lots of different topics, and I super enjoy it. And if that's something you need, please look into how I might be able to help you. That's it for today. Before we leave, make sure today you give that child in your life a loving squeeze. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.